2017. Thank you so much for coming to our relaunch. What I would like to do is tell you a little bit about King's Think Tank for those of you who don't know, talk a little bit about what we had planned for this year, and then give to David, who he has indicated he'd like to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions afterwards. So, and then afterwards, please join us for a wine reception. So, firstly, I would actually like to introduce our guest. I have the right honourable David Lidigton here, Leader of the House of Commons, who has generously volunteered his time this evening. Thank you so much. I have our patron, Timothy Hales, Alderman for the Ward of Bassishaw, the City of London, and it's through your personal and financial support that King's Think Tank is the organisation that it is. Thank you. I also have Professor Franz Burkhardt, the Executive Dean of Social Science and Public Policy faculty. We're very pleased to have you here in person. Thank you for that. So, for those of you who don't know anything about King's Think Tank, I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. We are the largest student-led policy institute in Europe with over 4,000 members, which we just think is fantastic and incredible. Our whole purpose, this is our mission statement here, is to empower the student body with the tools necessary to become proactive in decision-making, having a say before a policy is formulated. And this comes from the days when King's Think Tank was first created. So picture 2010 and the student riots. You have over 50,000 students marching through central London, protesting the planned spending cuts to further education and an increase in tuition fees. A very reactive demonstration, and unfortunately, from what I understand, ultimately unsuccessful. Our founder, Benedict Council, realised that these reactionary efforts led to no actual policy outcome or decisions, and thus King's Think Tank was born, with the aim of empowering students, as I said, to give them the tools necessary to truly affect and have a say in the policies that are made that affect them. Since then, King's College London students have proven to be an excellent audience, shown by a fantastic turnout tonight, thank you, and eager to listen to other opinions and share their own. We are proud of everyone that has turned up, and past and present members, and the quality policy recommendations that they put out. Really quality, innovative, and student-led. Our aims also remain the same: to engage students in constructive discussions. We host what I think are some of the best expert panel events at King's College London, to ensure that discussions are high quality, informed, and impartial, and to network and connect with the decision makers to ensure that our policies are heard, and policies that any student cares about. And so now, in 2016, here we are again, and the whole landscape has changed. I've termed it bronze certainty. We live in the age of bronze certainty. Since June, we have a new Prime Minister, a new Cabinet, a new Commissioner, a pound falling in value. We have generations divided, social classes divided, the union divided. Myself, as you can hear by my accent from Australia, just going, well, what have you done? And what will happen? Like, are we going to have a hard Brexit? Are we going to have a soft Brexit? Speaking personally, could you please sweep this under the carpet and pretend it never happened, Brexit? But what does this leave King's Think Tank in? Like, what do we do? What role do we actually have? And actually, we have the same role: to empower the student body with the tools necessary to become proactive in decision making, having a say before policy is formulated, because policies happen at every level. They don't just happen at the European Union level, they don't just happen at Westminster, they happen at the local level, they happen at the university, they happen at the regional level, they happen at the international level, and that's where we come in. So, King's Think Tanks, it's a student-led society, it's affiliated with King's College London. More than 12% of students are EU nationals at King's College London, and 25% of the students are international. Our committee, some of whom you'll meet this evening, includes more international and EU students than it does actual British people, which I think is a fantastic kind of representation of diversity. Our members are students from all different backgrounds, focused on inclusive policy recommendations. And so in this age of what I've called bronze certainty, King's Think Tank exists to give voice to what you care about, to take the voice and shape it into quality, innovative policies and ensure that they are heard. And so with that in mind, I'd like to actually introduce you to our 7 policy center presidents for the year and tell you a bit about what we want to focus on this year. So I have our 7 policy center presidents sitting at the front. If I'd like to ask to stand up in front here, and I will introduce them individually and talk about what they'll focus on. So we have 7 policy centers at King's Think Tank, and they each have particular topics, and I'll give a run through. So business and economics, I present Shimon Zanaduk. So for business and economics this year, challenges facing the global economy will form thematic focus. We need to become active participants in developing new economic frameworks and looking for new formulas for development in this growing climate of political risk and uncertainty. I'm introducing them as well so that during the wine reception and throughout the year, you can actually come and talk to these people and say, hey, I want to get involved. And these are the faces that you want to come and talk to. European affairs, I have Alexander Bodashev. The question of Europe clearly is one of the definitions. To the west, Britain voted to leave the EU. To the east, Putin's party roars through parliamentary elections. Fears of ISIS continue, and Europe continues to face radical problems within tightening austerity, influx of migrants, spread of terrorism, the rise of the far right. So then, what exactly is Europe? We need to define that. Defence and diplomacy, Stanislav Scriabin. In today's era of unprecedented interconnectedness, cooperation and communication, fundamental political changes are occurring. The rising tide again of populism and its possible impact on the current geopolitical order, the role of emerging state powers like Brazil, and their role in handling international crises. Law, Jagoda Klimovic. Equality is the important centralizing force in law this year. It attaches to almost every area of law and has a huge impact on our lives. We start this year with gender equality and on the pay gap, an issue still requiring change and improvement here, even in the UK. And the potential for King's Think Tank in making this change is vital as we focus on formulating policy recommendations. Unfortunately, we don't have Liam Taggart, the Energy and Environment Policy Centre President, here this evening, but he wants to focus getting energy and environment policy right is crucial to securing a safer, cheaper and healthier future. These policies affect us at an immediate local level and obviously threaten our long-term security. We're going to be working in partnership with King's Sustainability, looking at the extent and effects of air pollution in London and hopefully submitting our policy recommendations to the Mayor of London's clean air pollution. And this is also our opportunity to ensure we promote low carbon technologies in industry and the energy sector to meet our legally binding emissions target and protect our planet. We also unfortunately don't have education, Joshua Roy. So he's not here this evening. Education is the most powerful tool for shaping our future, which is why we're here and we're studying. It can influence diplomatic relations and even prove instrumental in counterterrorism. And so we're going to ask in the Education Policy Centre, is education being used properly? We're going to try and facilitate cultural cohabitation in multicultural societies such as the UK, and research, for example, language policies, dismissive attitudes towards foreign language teaching in the UK, and the existing policies such as the Prevent strategy. And finally, global health, Sweta Ragavan, I didn't check, I'm sorry. Health is obviously it's a function of welfare. In an increasingly shrinking world, the health and well-being of people and poverty everywhere is essential. And diseases and poverty, unfortunately, they respect no boundaries. Therefore, it calls for greater global coordination and cross-border cooperation to tackle the growing healthcare concerns. We will focus on 3 major concerns this year: challenging healthcare needs of displaced persons, improving preventative medicine and emergency response, and following the UK's divorce from the European Union, retaining our position as one of the world's top destinations for healthcare research and innovation. So please, afterwards at the wine reception, come and say hello to our policy centres. Thank you. I will talk quickly a little bit more. I have, as I said, our patron here, Tim Hales, and the Department of Political Economy. We also have our core committee that I will talk through quickly. Myself as president and Shona Koklias as vice president. We have 2 directors, Diana Denega and Vinnie Treasurer Anusha Tanasekaran, Head of Communications Betty Gonzalez, Bradley Albro as Head of Lidigton, Rocky Howe, who I will introduce later, General Editor, Angus Watson as Social Secretary. And I've talked through the policy studies. So, but this is the important thing. How can you get involved? Through our events, through our policy writing, through our publications. Please come, 20th of October, the European Affairs Policy Centre is doing an event, Brexit and the European Union, the future of Europe. 27th of October, the Law Policy Centre is doing Please Mind the Gap, Law and Gender Equality, sponsored by DLA Piper. And on the 8th of November, the Education Policy Centre is doing Education and Counterterrorism, Can You Teach Peace? Everybody's writing that tonight.
It's a good sign.
We're also really hoping to do some training this year. We're going to be actually hosting policy writing workshops. Although we're not affiliated with it, we wholly support the Policy Idol, the Policy Institute, and I have some flyers here at the side. We're hoping to do leadership and communication skills training with the King's Wellbeing, and also conflict management training with the Centre for Ethical Dispute Resolution. But it really is all about policies. I've said it many times, student-led policies. Please help us to write policies that are important to you. Please help us to make sure our policy gets heard at every level. And then finally, I'd like to introduce our General Editor, because one of the amazing things that we'd love you to get involved is actually writing for us, for our blog and for our biannual publication, The Spectrum. So this is Rocky Howe. Please come and say hello to him afterwards at the wine reception, and please take a copy of our Spectrum, the latest edition of our Spectrum, by the door. And finally, our guest speaker, the Right Honourable David Lidington MP, Leader of the House of Commons and Lord President of the Council since July 2016, Minister of State for Europe from May 2010 until July 2016, and elected Conservative MP for Aylesbury since 1992. I'd like to give the floor to you.
Henry, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the invitation today. It's good to see my old friend Tim Hales, your patron, here today. I mean, Tim and I first met at King's, I think more years ago than I would care to remember now, when I had hair and
I was younger.
And Tim was younger, and I was working for the then Foreign Secretary Douglas Stern, who came to address a meeting like this at King's, and Tim was sort of the student organiser of the event. But I'm really delighted that you've asked me to help you to relaunch the think tank, because I am genuinely pleased to see such commitment being made to involve younger people, the people whose choices and decisions are going to govern how this country, how Europe, how the world runs in the decades to come, in studying, discussing, debating and understanding political issues in their broadest sense, national and global. It is one of the most dispiriting experiences for any politician. When at an election you knock on somebody's door and it's opened by that great political prize, a new voter, and you do your spiel about who you're supporting, or if you're the candidate, what you stand for. You ask how they're going to vote, and you get a sort of fairly blank look that says, "Well, I don't really know. I'm not bothering to vote." And in the referendum this year, here you referred to the difference in the voting patterns between the generations. That's certainly true. But what was also the case is that sadly younger voters in the referendum, as in every other type of election, voted in far fewer numbers than did older voters. And that disparity in turnout was an important part of the explanation for the overall national result. Now, I'm not going to go into sort of a lot of detail about where we are, how after the referendum, how negotiations might or might not go. You're welcome to ask me questions about that afterwards. But what I want to do is to take a step back, because it seems to me that in or out of the European Union, the reality is that the United Kingdom, along with the whole of democratic Europe, faces what Hilary rightly described as an age of great turbulence and uncertainty. We are living through a time in which there are multiple and interrelated crises that are shaking profoundly a lot of the political and economic assumptions that my generation has grown up to think of as familiar. And the first, perhaps most obvious of those, is the economic crisis. When I look at Europe, it seems to me that that is a three-headed crisis. First of all, it is the case that most European economies, particularly those in southern Europe, have struggled hard to recover from the crash of 2008-2009 and from the unwise decisions on borrowing and spending that preceded those events. We have, as a consequence, youth unemployment in much of southern Europe that has been of frankly scandalous proportions, 50% more increase for years, which has dashed the hopes and ambitions of a generation, that has driven a great deal of the movement that we have seen. It is frankly a tragedy that you can go into a sandwich bar in London and be served by a university graduate from Spain or Greece or Portugal, who's there not because it's fun to go live in London for a bit and experience life here, but because they come in out of desperation, having tried and been unable to find any sort of graduate work or other work in their own country. So we have a big enough challenge in Europe in recovering from 2008, but that is happening at the same time as two other economic crises, each of which on its own I would regard as existential. The first is the impact of globalization, that we are seeing the integration into a world economic system of perhaps 2.5 billion people in the emerging economies. That is bound to be a trend that is profoundly destabilized, that acts as a major shock on traditional patterns of trade and of employment, and on where it is viable to carry out certain types of business around the world. And you only have to look to take one top example this year about steel. And it's the fact that Chinese demand for steel took up, let's say, a massive share of the world's supply, that bred increased production, and then left steel producers in Britain, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in many parts of the world in desperate difficulties when Chinese demand suddenly dropped as a result of the downturn in that country's economic growth. But we're also, it's all another feature of that trend and that crisis is that you have emerging economies now that are not any longer content, and why should they be, to provide the low-cost, low-skilled, low-paid work, but are increasingly looking to compete with the developed economies to provide the goods and services that countries in Western Europe or North America have assumed that it is their right to develop and sell elsewhere around the globe. And it seems to me that there are both great perils but also great opportunities in globalization. Yes, it disturbs the established order, but it also creates massive new prospective markets of people for goods, services that we in this country are able to provide. And the third great economic challenge is the impact of digital technology. And I don't think that any of us, and you in the audience here, are going to be much more on top of this subject than I am. But I don't think that we have really comprehended how profoundly digital technology is likely to shake up ways in which we think about work, ways in which we live our lives. We are already seeing the impact of digital technology blur the conventional boundaries between manufacturing and services. You could say that an old vinyl record was a manufactured product. So a CD or DVD, probably the same. What is a download? Is that manufacturing or services? What is how do you find the software that makes it possible for music to be streamed in a particular way? And I think that we are starting already now to see digital technology shake up white-collar and professional work just as profoundly as automation transformed factory floor working a generation ago. When I talk to lawyers and accountants and even journalists, they all talk about how within quite a short time we can expect algorithms and artificial intelligence to have been developed sufficiently to enable quite a lot of the relatively routine functions that those professionals carry out today to be done by computers in the future. We're seeing already the impact of digital technology on car hire and taxi businesses, through things like Uber, on the hotel sector, through Airbnb and other such enterprises. We cannot disinvent either globalization or digital technology. The question, it seems to me, is how do we ensure that those inevitable things work as best we can to our mutual benefit. The second crisis I will describe as geopolitical. And I readily concede, in a short time, I'm going to oversimplify a lot of this. But it seems to me that many of the assumptions that we've taken for granted, certainly since the late 1940s and even since the end of the Cold War, are also now being shaken to their foundations. You look across the Atlantic, we see a United States that is turning inwards. And that's not just, something you associate with Donald Trump. It is very striking how Hillary Clinton's campaign has gone colder on free trade. It is striking to see how United States opinion is increasingly saying to its politicians, you should be putting America first, whether they're talking about international economic affairs, or whether they are talking about defence and security matters, with American impatience at the fact they pay for 70% of NATO being expressed more vocally in Congress with each year that passes. And I think whoever is president, we are likely to see that political pressure continue, as well as the United States seeing a rising and assertive China as a strategic challenge, and therefore devoting more of its political time and energy looking across the Pacific rather than across the Atlantic. And that trend is happening at the same time as we see to the east a Russia that is more truculent and aggressive than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War. And you can examine the historical explanations for Putin, but it seems to me the reality about Russia today is that President Putin has quite deliberately departed from the fundamental principle of the Helsinki Acts, that existing territorial boundaries in Europe should be respected. We saw that in Crimea, we've seen it with the intervention in eastern Ukraine, and we've seen through the overflights of the Baltic states and Scandinavian countries, we've seen it in Syria, where I think Putin is following the Chechnya playbook almost to the letter, that you have a Russia that is wanting to assert its influence and power in a brutal fashion, and which finds that in doing so it can help to rally its own public opinion for the assertion of nationalism at a time when Russia is facing an economic crisis, with an economy that has been very oil and gas dependent, that is suffering a great deal at the moment, is structurally flawed, and with a demographic crisis in Russia, whereby at the moment the population is both aging and shrinking, and the only element of the Federation's population that is increasing now is the population of the North Caucasus, that brings about a set of social and political challenges that you can readily understand. And if that were not enough, we see on Europe's doorstep in the Middle East and Africa a collapse of the traditional political authorities, a challenge to those traditional regimes which remain, made worse by economic performance, which even in the more successful states struggles to meet the ambitions of a population that is increasingly young. Most of these countries in North Africa and the Middle East, you look at 60% or more of the population aged under 30. So multiple geopolitical crises, plus a demographic crisis. Because if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, or parts of Asia, we see the population structures even more weighted towards the young. The Economist predicts that within a very few decades, Africa will be home to just under half of all the world's teenagers. And even the successful African economies are just not generating the jobs, the opportunities to satisfy the hopes and aspirations of those young people. That challenge is made worse by climate change. It is made worse by poor governance and corruption and poverty. And I don't believe that the migration crisis that Europe faces today is something for 1 year or 2 years. I think it is with Europe for at least a generation. Because I just do not see how it would be possible to avoid the temptation for very large numbers of young people in particular to put their faith, sadly, in very unscrupulous but very professional people smugglers and try their chance by moving elsewhere. And I'm absolutely convinced that no one country, not us, not Germany, not France, can come up with the answers to this, nor do I think there's an easy, quick solution to this. This will be a challenge that involves using all the instruments of policy, whether development or law enforcement against a transnational crime, people smuggling, help to secure stronger governance, and so on. Now those crises, economic, geopolitical and demographic, have made worse social and political tensions that we have seen around us, most obviously in European countries, but also in the United States. I vividly remember Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, saying to me when we were talking about British politics, he said, "David, you must tell Nigel Farage that he is part of a European phenomenon." And it was, as often with Carl, I mean, there was a real truth behind the slightly light-hearted remark. Because what we have seen in Europe is the emergence of populist, sometimes outright extremist movements of both right and left in so many different countries. Leave UKIP to one side. You look at Front National, you look at Jobbik in Hungary, at Alternative in Germany. I mean, who would have thought that the Sweden Democrats would be in the position that they are in a country that has historically been as liberal and moderate in its politics as Sweden. And it seems to me that those political developments stem from economic discontent, above all from the fact that not just the young people that I talked about earlier, particularly in Southern Europe, but a lot of older people too feel that they are threatened, that their families are threatened by the changes, economic and political, that they are seeing in the world around them. And they are, I'm afraid, looking for a man or a woman on a white horse somehow to come and rescue them. Now, I may think, many of you may think, that the remedies offered by the populist and extremist movements are specious, are false promises, but we cannot ignore the reality of that discontent, that deep-seated worry that the established order is simply not delivering in a way that we, so many people, see as fair to us and our families. So what's to be done? Again, I'm going to do just the briefest sketch here. Well, first of all, there are limits to what the United Kingdom is able to do, and we've got to acknowledge those. You know, we were long past the day when we thought we could put the world to rights on our own, but we shouldn't either underrate what the United Kingdom ought to be capable of doing. We remain still the fifth largest economy in the world. We have significant armed forces and a tradition of being willing to deploy them. We have a formidable international aid and development budget. We have one of the strongest and highest quality diplomatic services anywhere in the world, made stronger by the fact that the United Kingdom has potent soft power assets in the forms of the English language, and much to do with the British tradition in terms of both artistic, cultural, and also scientific and educational achievement. So where does that leave us post-referendum? Well, as somebody who campaigns strongly on the Remain side, I nevertheless think that one has to acknowledge that the result, though relatively close, was still decisive. And I know of no government amongst the 27 other EU countries that thinks that this could somehow just be disregarded. It was democratically legitimate. But I think it's really important to hold on to what Theresa May has said more than once, which is that we may be leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. The facts of geography and history and common interest cannot be abolished. And one of the tasks for the British government is going to be to work out with the EU 27 and perhaps with other friendly countries in Europe too, a new way in which to preserve and improve cooperation within our own continent, whether we're talking about that in economic or in political or in security and crime fighting terms, or indeed in foreign policy cooperation. It seems to me that that is absolutely essential for our own national interests and for the prosperity and stability of Europe as a continent, which itself, given the history of the 20th century, we should never cease to regard as a profound British interest in its own right. And I would say, if I look at the global scene, we need to remain champions of free trade. We need to make sure that this country looks outwards rather than succumb to introversion, and that we try to support and strengthen a rules-based international order that is under attack from many different quarters at the moment. And we need to do that while at the same time as finding a way in which to reach out and restore lost public confidence in the political and economic systems of which we are the stewards today. And that takes us on to what the Prime Minister said about social reform, about tempering, acting against abuses of the capitalist system, about trying to ensure that there is genuine opportunity for people of all backgrounds and in every part of this country. It is a very ambitious agenda indeed, and I suspect that Theresa May will be the first to say that whatever she's able to accomplish, this is not a project that can be completed in the lifetime of one premiership. It will need sustained effort, and I hope effort from people of different political traditions in this country as well. So I think that we face enormous challenges, and I certainly hope that the generation represented in the audience today will, through the work of the think tank, and after you leave King's, make a vigorous and sustained contribution to finding answers to some of those problems that I've tried to describe. Thank you very much.
If anyone has any questions?
Yes.
So you talked about how there's a series of simultaneous crises happening across the world at the same time currently, and you think that's sort of part of a general sort of trend. To what extent do you think those crises are caused by a conflict between sort of the quote-unquote winners and losers to globalization?
I think that the economic tensions certainly are explained in large part by that. Certainly in the developed economies, I think that that is true. It's not just about that. I think that we would be foolish to ignore the fact that the public concern that every opinion poll measures about immigration is also to do with anxieties about identity and so on. But I think that those worries are made worse when people feel concerned and uncertain about the economic future for themselves and for their families. So part of the answer does indeed involve trying to make sure that that there is a sense of fairness and of equality of opportunity in our different societies. But in order for that to work, you've also got to continue to look very actively for ways in which we can adapt policy to seize the opportunities of what is happening. If you can imagine, to take a pretty obvious example, 5% of the population of China or India attaining the living standards of the average person in Western Europe or North America, that is a massive consumer market that you measure in the tens of millions for the things that we produce. And we also want to try and make sure that we have a rules-based international order in economics as well as political affairs, so that global competition, as it proceeds, respects things like intellectual property. So that the same ground rules against dumping, for example, are followed by governments in every part of the world. So having a rules-based international order is actually a part of the policy to try to secure that sense of greater fairness. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your conversation with us. It's very interesting. Seeing that we're a think tank and we're in a student environment, I think it's only fitting that I ask your opinion on the current policy proposals around reducing the number of foreign students to the UK that has been headed by the current government.
Well, it's what we're saying is that we want to continue to see Britain attracting students on pursuing genuine university and college courses. I think it's a great asset. It's a proven economic asset, as well as a cultural one, and a soft power asset to have universities and colleges that attract some of the brightest and best from around the world. What is, I'm afraid, also the case, and I've come across this in some of my own constituency cases, is that there have been institutions that have described themselves as colleges that have actually brought some trusting young people from developing countries into Britain on a false prospectus. And I've had people in my surgery, my constituency, from other parts of the world who came into, they thought to do a college course, they paid a fee, and it turns out that the college is a room above the fish and chip shop in a high street somewhere, that this has never been a properly accredited course. They've frankly been swindled out of the money that they paid in fees, and so I think we are quite right to try to crack down on what I describe as bogus colleges, and I think that's a policy that does need to continue. Lady in front, yes.
What about the policy of making companies declare foreign workers?
Well, what I was asked about this at Business Questions today. I mean, we're not talking about something like naming individuals, so we're not talking about having sort of company by company sort of published lists. What we're going up to consultation over is whether we should do what the United States does already, which is to have companies, it might become as above a certain threshold, say what proportion of their workforce is made up of people from other countries, because that would provide a way of measuring where there were demonstrable labour shortages of some kind, because that would be a message to government and to education and training systems that we might need to think again about manpower planning, about training systems, because it is the case at the moment that I don't criticise anybody who comes here in order to work and contribute to society, but it is also the case that there remain in parts of Britain a core of young people in particular who lack the skills that employers want at the moment. So I think there's a big policy challenge for government in actually trying to make sure that those young people in the United Kingdom in particular, but also older people who need retraining, acquire the skills. And that monitoring, that sort of monitoring that I've described, would help us to identify the professions and the sectors in which there's this mismatch at the moment. Then it's worth considering. And that's where we are at the moment. Next year.
Thank you very much for your insightful speech. I wanted to ask with regards to kind of your opinion on extremist parties.
Yeah.
Do you believe that constructive communication with such political entities is possible and thereby we will legitimize them? Or do you think we should not legitimize them and disregard them as a serious political entity?
This was something when I was Europe Minister that I had to deal with directly, because we had and continue to have a policy of British diplomats and certain ministers not talking to parties of a particular kind. And I think you've got to assess each such party on its own merits. So, for example, we don't have, as a government, any dealings with, direct dealings with alternative. Might be the British diplomat has to meet a select committee in the Bundestag, and there'll be won't be alternative members, but there might be somebody in a land committee, and you don't walk out of a meeting because somebody's there. We don't formally talk to Europe, though we can try to monitor what they're doing and saying. We do talk to the Five-Star Movement. Five-Star Movement is got an extremist party, it's a party which I have to disagree quite strongly, but it is a legitimate, if populist, democratic movement, the same way that UKIP is here. Front National is in at the moment in the category of parties that we don't do business with. Had Marine Le Pen been elected regional president of Calais Nord, there would have been a real dilemma for the British government, because you would have had somebody who'd been elected who had legal responsibilities for the government of a part of France which mattered a great deal for the travel of British visitors and for a lot of trade coming between our two countries there. So we try and look at each case rigorously on its own merits. I'm going to go back, lady there, then gentleman here.
What can the UK government be doing to improve their response to the Syrian refugee crisis?
Well, Syrian refugee crisis, I mean, I do actually think that we have a very good tale to tell. We went and put £2.5 billion on the table to try to help people in Syria or in the neighbouring countries. The reason why in 2015 we got the large movement of people across the Aegean was because governments, donors elsewhere had not come forward with the money the UN needed, and the UN in desperation cut food rations and cut schooling in the refugee camps in Turkey in particular. I mean, there is a pretty stark lesson for European countries. If you don't want people to travel, you have to enable them to have some hope and some life in the places where they find themselves. I think most Syrians, when they have got out of Syria, would still say that their first preference would be to go back and help rebuild a Syria that was a decent and fear-free place in which to live. I think the reality is that's not going to happen in the near future. I think that we need to address the root causes of the movement of refugees from Syria, that it involved obviously continuing the work, however difficult, to bring about a political process in Syria that would lead to a genuine ceasefire and ultimately to some kind of government of national unity. I'm afraid, I'll be honest with you, I think we are further from that today than we were a year ago, and I mean, if you draw me into it, I will certainly point the finger at Russian intervention as one of the key reasons for that. But I think I'd be lying to you if I said I thought there was a neat and easy answer to that. It's got to be a lot of humanitarian assistance. It's got to be pledges to help rebuild Syria when one day we have a stable, agreed government in place. It has to be diplomatic work to try to find a solution to the political crisis in Syria, working with other countries, even those with which we profoundly disagree. So we have to continue talking to Russia, we of course have to continue talking to Iran, and to the Saudis, and to the Qataris, because it's only when we get some sort of agreement that there has to be a better way forward than the slaughter that we're going to see a chance of peace. There's a gentleman here.
Me?
Yes?
You mentioned about the Brexit and the implications of the Brexit. Also, what do you think of the proposal of not allowing non-UK academics pitching ideas on the proposal for Brexit?
Well, the Foreign Office has put out a statement to say that report was not true. My understanding, Minister Tobias Ellwood, who has responsibility for that area of policy, has said publicly that the reports were inaccurate. I mean, what has always been the case is that with each bit of research work that the Foreign Office commissions from outside sources, it reserves the right to have some sort of security clearance for the individuals who are involved, whether they're British or non-British. For obvious reasons, it's usually easier to do a check on somebody if they're UK national than if they're from another country. But I can absolutely be clear that those reports were not accurate. There's now a couple of people. I'll come to two people at the back, and then I'll come down here. Yes, in the middle there first.
Just to follow up on the Syrian refugee crisis, what can the British government do specifically to improve the situation in Calais?
In Calais, I think that we have to continue to work with the French. It is French territory. There have been one or two of my parliamentary colleagues who said we should send the British Army into Calais. We haven't tried to do that since 1558. But it wasn't successful then. So I think that we have to continue to work with the French on security improvements there. We have contributed also to humanitarian help for people who are in those camps. And we need to do whatever we can to ensure that those children who have a legitimate right to come to the UK because they've got a family here already are able to do so. Now, there is a French legal process that has to be gone through for that to happen, but we have sent a British magistrate out to Calais to try to smooth that process. So I think we have to just reinforce the kind of work that we have been doing up till now, and the relationships between both the previous and the current Home Secretary and the French Interior Minister on all this have been very productive and very friendly indeed. The gentleman right at the back in the corner.
I have a question about sort of multilateral efforts of the UK vis-a-vis the EU in the future after Brexit, which I'm a half German, half Canadian national. We also expect that will happen. We're not under any illusions that it may not. But while you still have the possibility, you're not leaving NATO, so you have military issues, those are fine. But and obviously still bilateral relationships with France and Germany, etc., etc. But what about the value of having a seat at the Foreign Affairs Council at the EU level, and being able to be in the room when very key foreign policy decisions are made at the EU level? What are your thoughts on how any remnant of that influence might be preserved in the future?
Oh, you're right. I mean, it's one of the many reasons why I supported Remain. But I think that the way forward is to secure a recognition across Europe that, frankly, any notion of an effective European common foreign policy effort that ignores the United Kingdom is going to be fairly implausible. I know what worries Federica Mogherini at the moment, which is that the UK's departure is going to remove something like a fifth of her potential military capability and probably almost a quarter of her diplomatic capability. So the EU, as a global player, shrinks as a result of the UK's departure. So I think we have to be inventive and talk to our friends and neighbours about how we try to build a new structure for cooperation, accepting that we won't be part of the Foreign Affairs Council in the same way as we are as full EU members, because I think it's in Europe's common interest, not the British interest, that we make that happen. It'll be challenging, but I think if you look at the threats facing Europe, I think it's something that has to be done. Now, I'm going to come down to the gentleman with the cap. I think you had a...
David, I'm just going to say 5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes. Okay. I'm going to... Okay, I'll try and be short on my replies. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is more of a developmental question. So, do you feel that private foundations or philanthropic individuals are best placed actors in achieving success or resilience in cities?
I don't think there's a magic wand as to whether it's private or whether it's government. I mean, the private foundation, Gates, State Government's example, has flexibility that governments lack. Governments always have to have a set of rules and sort of strict criteria, and it's possible for private charitable efforts to be more nimble. But often the best way for governments to help can be to fund either charitable philanthropic foundations or the big NGOs to carry out particular work. But I think the principle is you've got to try to ensure that the money gets down to the grassroots level, in the country that you're trying to help, that you try to ensure so far as is possible that it is not siphoned off by people who are using it to fill bank accounts in Switzerland. And that, you know, and it's not rocket science, it's improving primary healthcare, improving primary education, empowering women in poorer countries. Those are the things that we know from experience will help to bring about the conditions for better long-term development.
The only thing is also, you know, when it comes to the Rockefeller Foundation, the program of 100 resilient cities, where London are also registered for it, and there's a whole process for that. So, in understanding that is what you feel the future of power is sort of shifting towards cities rather than the state.
Oh, the cities, I'd say, I think it's a very interesting question, because I think if you talk to George Osborne, he might well agree with you, because I mean, one of the things that we're seeing throughout the world is accelerated urbanisation. And you're seeing people coming together in mega cities that are important both as sense of economic activity, but also of cultural life. And we're not at the stage where we're thinking in terms of city-states, but I think, you know, so the period of human history seems to be we are moving into now is one where you will have the great majority of the population in large urban conurbations, or perhaps we now start to think of Northern England as linked conurbations. I mean, that's what the concept of the Northern Powerhouse is all about. And each of which then has a certain critical mass in terms of population and economic performance. That enables it to thrive. And things like communications, whether digital comms or physical transport communication between cities, is both nationally and internationally is going to be increasingly important. If anybody here reads the FT weekend colour mag, and there's a journalist called Simon Cooper who writes a regular column there, and he'd often written on this theme that he could see London one day having almost satellite cities like Rotterdam or Birmingham or Paris included in that in my article, but which were less expensive than living in London and become a sort of global city, but still were linked close enough so there would be the quality of cultural life and of economic opportunity that a London or a New York or a Tokyo was producing. I've come back a second chance later, but who hasn't had a first chance? Yes.
So my question is about Brexit and the EU, and obviously there's a lot of confusion about what Britain looks like after the European Union. But my question is about what Europe looks like from a British perspective, especially as part of a government of a nation who rejected the idea of European citizenship. That's one.
I think that the EU 27 will have to make up their minds at some stage about how they create political structures that recognise the reality that there are big differences between countries and within countries about the degree of integration that is desirable. Now, one model that I have for a long time felt would probably come about in the next 10, 20 years is of a more formal inner and outer tier structure. Because it seems to me that if the euro survives, and I don't think it's in our interest that it breaks up, then it is inevitable that those countries that share a currency, an interest rate, and a monetary policy will need to integrate their fiscal and economic arrangements more closely, and that in turn requires a measure of political integration in order to hold those Eurozone economic policy decisions democratically accountable in some way. And you go to Brussels or you go to Paris or Rome, and people are talking about that in the think tanks in particular, about, well, should we have a special Eurozone assembly or a Eurozone finance minister or a committee of MEPs and national parliamentarians from Eurozone countries. But there are others who are not going to go down that course. And I always felt, that we'd stayed in the EU, we were never likely to change our minds in my lifetime. The euro, I can't see Sweden or Denmark doing the same. I look at the current state of opinion polls in Poland, and it's a small minority in Poland who want to join the euro. Hungary has written the forint as its national currency into its constitution. It means it needs a 2/3 majority ever to go into the euro. And I think Romania and Bulgaria are quite a long way up from joining the euro, though that may be what those governments still aspire to do one day. So I think some sort of more formal division will actually make Europe a more comfortable place. There will be fewer arguments if those relationships can be sorted out in that fashion. Right.
Two more questions.
Two more questions. I'm going to go to people who haven't asked. So it's the lady there and lady there.
So you referred to poor turnout in the Brexit referendum. You referred to poor turnout on the part of young people in the Brexit referendum. So how can, what have we learned from it, and how can we in future be like the King's College or the British government take any measures to improve political participation?
Right. Thank you. I'll take the other questions. I'll try and answer the two together.
It's about the migration crisis.
Yes.
And to what extent do you think that Brexit would be an advantage for the UK regarding their corporate responsibility to take in refugees?
I think on your question, I don't think it will make any difference in terms of current asylum law with refugees. I mean, there's a longer term question for the world about whether arrangements that were devised in the 1950s with the idea that people went to the next door country for safety still works in a world where people will cross continents and where you have transnational criminal gangs that are organised to try to get people to move in large numbers and take their life savings from them as the price of so doing. But I think the advantages for the United Kingdom will be in re-establishing national control over movement of all people, so that concessions, allowances, special preferences and so on would be a matter of national decision. I talked to all employers who say we're still going to need quite a lot of workers from outside this country if we're to continue business. So, but it would be seen, I think, by many of those who voted to leave. They saw the reassertion of national decision taking over this as an absolutely critical element. On the doorstep, it was immigration again and again and again, and was coming up as a reason for voting to leave. Now, on your question about how to encourage participation for young people, well, I mean, look, can I be quite honest with you? I suspect that a solemn ministerial broadcast urging young people to get more involved in politics is not going to be the most effective means. Now, there are things that governments can do. We can try and harness communications, and the government and the Electoral Commission do use things like social media already to try to encourage voter registration, greater participation. But this may be provocative to say, but I also think that there is a responsibility on the young people themselves. I'm tempted to say to my constituents, young or old sometimes, they tell me, oh, I'm not going to bother voting, they're all the same. I say, fine, but don't you come grumbling to me afterwards when something goes wrong if you haven't been bothered to turn out and vote yourself. And I would say to young people, get involved in some way. I suspect that there will be people here whose political sympathies lie in a number of different places along the spectrum. Okay, whichever political party is closest to your point of view. They're all coalitions. None of this is perfect. I don't agree with a lot of things some of my colleagues say, but it is a coalition in the Conservative Party as in the Labour Party. And go and join, get involved in the political party that is closest to your point of view, try and help influence its policy development if you want to try and stand for election at either local or national level. If you don't want to get involved in party politics, but I would say it is through party still ultimately that in most democracies things get done and governments are sustained, then get involved with a particular pressure group of some kind, whether that is to do with environmental protection or climate change or developing world debt and humanitarian assistance. Get hands-on and get involved. And if you have something that is bothering and troubling you, that you think is going wrong, don't just grumble about it to your friends. Send an email to your Member of Parliament or your local councillor, as appropriate, to say this, what you think, and ask for a reply. Please, don't just tick the box on the 38 Degrees webpage. We're all used to that now. 200 identically worded emails are pretty weak currency when we know that all anybody's done is type their name and their postcode into the webpage to begin with. But an email that is clearly the product of thought, if it's from your own constituent, almost every MP will take seriously, irrespective of political party, irrespective of whether the MP agrees or disagrees with the constituent. And MPs talk to each other. We chat at the tea room, and we said, I'm getting all these emails about butterfly conservation. I've had to say there's something going on. Have we mentioned it to the minister? And you get this sort of political osmosis that, over time, may start to effect a change in policy. And I would highlight the Jubilee campaign, the Drop the Debt campaign, as having been very telling examples of how political activity and political engagement can help to bring about a quite profound difference in terms of public policy. So I'd use that as your example.
One final thing before we can all go to our wine reception. I would like